Welcome to the Energetic Psyche, a weekly podcast hosted by yours truly, Dr. Adrian Campbell, where we talk about real life, challenge assumptions, and explore different ways of being in the world. This week, for episode 23, I have Dr. Mindy Nettifee joining me to discuss her work as a professional poet, somatic experiencing practitioner, and how she works to heal trauma through unearthing the natural voice. I hope you enjoy. So welcome to the Energetic Psyche, a weekly podcast hosted by yours truly, Dr. Adrian Campbell. This week, I have Dr. Mindy Nettifee joining me as a co-host to discuss her work as a professional poet, somatic experiencing practitioner, and how she works to heal trauma through unearthing the natural voice. A little bit about Dr. Mindy. She's a poet, a professional teaching artist, a somatic therapist, and educator specializing in trauma healing and expression. She holds a doctorate in depth psychology with a specialization in somatic studies, same as me. That's how we met. Her research documents the impact of trauma on the voice and languaging and the role voice plays in the trauma healing and integration process. One-on-one and in groups, she works with those recovering and developing their capacity for free, full, resonant expression, as well as those seeking to discover or more fully embody and enact their vocation. Dr. Mindy draws from a wide array of professional trainings to personalize each session. Specific approaches you can explore if you decide to work with her include somatic experiencing, trauma resolution, narrative and poetic methods, somatic meditation, embodied dream work, archetypal psychology, and sound healing. Mindy also offers workshops and process groups for writers, teachers, mystics, and guides. And yours is the post that I always share for your full moon posts and your new moon posts because they're just beautiful. I love your writing.
Thank you.
Yeah. So thank you for being here.
It's a pleasure to be here and connect with you again, Dr. Adrian.
I know when we met back in 2014.
2014. So 10 years ago.
Yes. We were not doctors. No. Not yet. Nope. But we got there through trial and trial. So many trials. And look at us now.
It's true. We climbed the mountain, and discovered the base of another mountain.
Exactly how it goes. It's exactly how it goes. Right. Oh my gosh. And I am so excited to have you here, honestly, because even though I always feel so close to you, like I said, when we first connected, I was like, we haven't seen each other in 7 years, which is wild. And we chat here and there, but I feel I have this undercurrent of connection to you that I know that I don't have to be like contacting you and talking to you all the time. And so I know you, but your work has developed and grown so much that I'm really excited to hear about it today. So let's start from the beginning though, help everybody get to know you. So tell us a little bit about yourself.
Ooh, my origin stories. Let's see. I am, first of all, like a double preacher's daughter. That just sort of feels important to say right at the top.
Yeah.
Both of my parents were ministers. I come from a little bit of a extended family where there's a lot of that going on. But my father also came out of the closet when I was about 4 years old. And so life, that path took a turn sort of pretty quickly. And I always like to say that this is one of the ways I understand myself is that I became a poet and a performance poet pretty young. I started going to open mics, I think at 12 or 13 years old.
Yes.
And I really learned to write by listening to people reading their own work. And so I learned it as a kind of oral, performed art form and not just on the page. But I think I was so drawn to poetry and performance poetry because I was sort of born to be a preacher, but also was born into circumstances that made sort of organized religion extremely undesirable. Just put it that way. Yeah. And so poetry was this perfect sort of place where I could still explore the essence of that, but in a way that felt very liberating, and certainly liberated in from the power dynamics and kind of control complex of religion. But anyway, I became a poet. I
just have to say, like, that makes so much sense. And I didn't know that about you.
It makes sense, right?
It makes so much sense. Yeah. And I love how you like connected that. Like connected it. Yeah. Because I mean, sometimes we do these things, we have no idea, you know, but yeah, that's crazy.
I mean, I also did not grow up under the impression that like poet was a job like that I could have. And in many ways, the fact that I didn't view it as a kind of professional pathway sort of allowed it to grow and flourish without any of the, you know,
monetary pressure.
That's right.
Yeah.
So I was always sort of like studying, you know, in my sort of studies in my early, you know, gosh, when I went to get a bachelor's degree, I think I studied social sciences, political science, psychology. I was particularly interested in power, like in the nature of power and who has it and who doesn't and how do you get it and what's going on there. But meanwhile, poetry would sort of like fill every like crack in my time until it was, you know, I competed in national poetry slams like in 1998, maybe to 2003.
That's awesome.
Long ago.
I love poetry slams. I love them.
I love poets. I mean, poets really saved my life. You know, I came from a pretty broke, you know, my family is pretty broken, and I was a serious kid. You know, I was like a dark, serious kid, and I could sort of sense growing up where I grew up that also, that the sort of something wasn't right with the culture, and poets were sort of like actively these just sort of eccentric, free. It was like an anti-capitalist thing they were doing. It was like, wow, not only these people seem to not care about making money, they're like destroying money. You know, we're like it felt so good, and it saved my soul in a really big way from the sort of harsher, components of Western, you know, money culture.
You know, one of my favorite quotes ever is by a novelist, and it's poetry heals the wounds inflicted by reason.
Yes.
And that's, I mean, for me, that's what poetry has been my entire life is like, it's just, I just got
reason, the wounds of literalism.
Right.
And this sort of willful ignorance that empirical science is invested in, like a willful ignorance of the interconnectedness of all things.
Yeah, of the soul, right? The depth of humanity, the depth of our experience. Yeah.
And poetry gives you this permission to really witness the world as alive, you know? So it's definitely like a gateway drug to magic and mysticism and animism, you know, because you know, you're trying to witness the world with language. And so you start witnessing things really exquisitely and discovering what that sort of not only can language describe, of course, like it tries anyway, it's trying to kind of like describe the meaning it's witnessing, but that in the process of that, it starts to create new meanings that aren't already there. You start to create reality. So I think everybody should have some basic training in poetry. I think it develops our higher linguistic functions. It develops the right brain circuits and helps prepare you, I think, it helps develop your symbolic intelligence.
It helps you connect. Yeah, in a very different way. I mean, I don't know if I ever told you. So I started writing poetry when I was like 10 and like won some contest when I was 12. And then, you know, basically was told to like grow up and that's not where you should be putting your attention. And so I stopped. But when I lived in Denver, after I left the Coast Guard, I would go to open mic nights and wouldn't tell anybody.
Denver has a great poetry scene.
Mercury Cafe was like my favorite. And but I would go by myself. I wouldn't tell, you know, friends and stuff. And I would go read my poetry. And like, I stopped again writing for a long time. And Pacifica helped bring some of that back, entering into depth. And then just recently, I've written 2 poems in like the last few months, and I haven't written in years.
Well, you're
So
going through a soul rebirth.
yeah, it's
And
just,
poetry is the language of that, you
it's
know?
beautiful to be in that
Yeah.
space. Yeah.
So that's sort of my root system is in poetry. And I started, publishing, I think in my late 20s. I went through a period where I remember thinking, I was like, I was invited. My first book, I was invited to publish with a small press called Moontide Press. Moontide. Anyway, we'll come back to that. But they invited me to publish a book. And I thought, that would be such a good way to kind of like close this time in my life when when I'm invested in poetry, to like really honor it by like putting out a collection and then sort of moving on. I'm still kind of completely unconscious of the role that poetry is going to play in my life. And
how old were you when this was happening?
What's that? I'm probably 27, 20.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it came out when I was 28. This is my first collection was called Sleepyhead Assassins.
Nice.
It's still out there. You can get it. And sort of the opposite thing happened. Actually, right, this is one thing I learned then, is that when you create an artifact, right, it actually sort of more intensely materializes everything in the world. Right? It's the art of making something affect. And suddenly, like poetry doors started opening and opening. I started working, not just performing, but I started a nonprofit organization with Amber Tamblyn, dedicated to promoting poetry in particular.
The book you guys came out with, was that 3, 4, 5 years ago? God. Listening in the Dark.
Just 2 years ago.
2 years ago. Oh my God. That book is fantastic.
Yeah,
I think I own like 3 books that 2 you wrote, 2 of your collections. And then that one, such a beautiful book with so many gorgeous stories.
Yeah,
oh my God.
On intuition by many, many women.
Goosebumps again.
Yeah.
Apparently this is what's going to happen our entire podcast.
For a while I was just producing poetry events. I started teaching, and I was constantly being asked to teach poetry in environments where people were really struggling. So I would be teaching in transitional homes for foster care youth. I did a lot of work with an organization that worked with survivors of sex trafficking. And so I was doing these creative writing workshops in places with very traumatized people.
Yeah.
And I could see, I was just flying, I was just using my intuition in these spaces. I had no idea what was really going on. I could see that some of what I was doing was working. And I would see people go through these incredible transformations where they would go from being like highly defended and shut down to literally coming back to life, like through their voice, and with, it might take years, but like, it was like a transformation to the person would be completely unrecognizable. This person initially who was had a small voice and was very shy would suddenly be giving everybody shit, like taking up space,
Yeah.
Like what is going on? And while I enjoyed doing it, I also found it very, very stressful.
I can imagine.
Because I had no training.
Yeah.
So I reached some kind of point, in my early 30s where my life fell apart, and I was like drawn into the abyss, as one is from time to time, in order for, when you're kind of out of alignment with where your path needs to go next, soul just comes in and ruins everything.
Flip the boat.
All gone. Start from scratch.
Yes.
And, I felt what felt like a completely irrational call to go to grad school. Irrational because I was a professional poet. I had done the thing where you go and like follow your bliss. And I was almost embarrassed at how stuck and unhappy I was in this kind of dream career.
Yeah.
And also it seemed the logical move you would think would be to go get an MFA, or like, you know what I mean? To go, it's like go deeper in the direction of this thing. And every time I thought about doing that, it would just like shut my entire system down. So I finally just let myself ask this question of like, what would I do if I didn't have to explain it to anybody? This was the magic question that helped me like
I remember talking about this.
get out of this like somehow extricate all this conditioning, right? That was that I'd been making all my decisions from. And just let myself imagine in a world where I didn't owe anybody anything explanation wise. And that other people's anxieties about me and my life, or if I was going to be okay, like just didn't matter. And I thought then my next question was like, well, gosh, like what conversation is so interesting to me that I could have it for the next 50 years and not get bored?
These are some beautiful questions.
Yeah. Right? I think it's a powerful question. Yeah. And it may not have an answer, but if it does, that's like a pretty big clue. Right?
I really think anyone listening or watching this, if you take nothing else from this talk, those two questions, ask yourself those two questions.
What would you do if you didn't have to explain it to anybody? And what was the second question I just said?
What could I talk about for 50 years?
What conversation could you have for the next, you can fill in the number of years you'd like that makes sense without getting bored. And the truth is, the thing that really, really fascinated me was the mind-body connection, the unconscious mind. This, but in particular, this embodied sort of aspect of it. And of course, like the world of neuroscience was exploding. And this idea that there could be a sort of like, that we could be witnessing things about the body that helped us to like understand what only mystics could really explain in mystical symbolic language, that there might be this other window into that. I could read about that forever. I could talk about that forever. Anybody wants to talk about their dreams or like, or this kind or strange phenomena, I'm like, yes. Let's
right. I'm here for it.
And so that's how I found my way to Pacifica, this program that Dr. Adrian and I took together in their PhD in depth psychology with the emphasis in somatic studies. And I thought that I was going to study creativity in the unconscious mind. Right? That makes sense. Yeah. And I did, but during the second year, we took this class in trauma studies. Had a terrible title. What was it? It was like trauma, pain, and dissociation was the title of this course. Yeah. So we show up for the first day of the course and we're all like,
was that Joe's course?
What's that?
Was it Joe's course? Who taught that course?
No. Shoot. I'll have to look it up.
I know. I'm like, I need to go.
I sometimes have to like file a request, and then like 30 minutes from now, it'll come. Well,
especially like I'm my research right now is dissociation, and I've been pulling so much stuff, and I totally forgot about that.
Oh, you forgot that you took a class on dissociation where we were all completely dissociated the entire time.
That's crazy.
I don't know if you remember, but it was a male teacher. And he actually, in the very first class, he did something very sweet where he put out a group of just like small little round stones. And he asked each of us to pick up to like select our own kind of stone of protection. And he did. He tried to do some things initially.
I think I do, because it was not a professor that we had regularly.
You gave we only had him that one time.
And his name was Gary.
Yes, Glickman.
I think so.
Dr. Glickman.
There we go.
Gary, yes. So during that class, I had the craziest things happen. I think like maybe in the second class, I had this. We were going to have to do a final project where we had a choice. We could write a paper or we could give a presentation on a story, like a myth or a story that sort of said something about the trauma and healing journey that we could sort of relate to our own understanding of this material. And at some point I just, checked out in the middle of a class.
Yeah.
These were very long days, and we were studying dissociation. So we were all like in and out. And I dissociated from whatever was happening. And I had this wonderful image come in. And it was in the image, we were all putting red. I was like making everyone put red body glitter on their feet. And then we were like clicking our heels together and saying, "There's no place like home."
Yeah.
And I was like, oh my God, first of all, I'm doing that. My final project, I'm going to give a talk on The Wizard of Oz.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to make everybody put on red body glitter.
I remember this.
Remember this?
So I remember why I don't remember a lot of this class, because my grandfather was dying at the time.
Ugh.
And I missed one of our 3 on-campus days.
You like missed the second.
And so I was very lost, and he was not great at supporting my absence. So yeah. But anyways, I remember the Yellow Brick Road. That presentation was fucking awesome.
And I mean, The Wizard of Oz became this like mnemonic device for me, through which I was able to really like organize all of this kind of these vastly different theories about trauma and healing, both from the depth psychological side, which is like trauma and the soul, and then from the neurobiological side, from all of these sort of new studies about trauma and the nervous system. So that, for example, it's like the Tin Man, represents the freeze state, the parasympathetic nervous system, right. And the Scarecrow represents like what happens to cognition, during trauma, like it just fries out and you're all over the place. And the Cowardly Lion represents what happens to the sympathetic system. And so every character sort of is holding this kind of deeper truth about trauma and healing. And I gave a presentation, and then everybody had to make a yellow brick road with yellow Post-its. And then I read some poetry, I think. And then we did the red body glitter thing, where we all sort of like used our own mercurial, alchemical powers to like come back home to our bodies, like at the end.
Yeah.
So right after, as we were leaving that class, Gary says to me, he says, "I didn't know that was going to be your dissertation topic." And I was like, it's not. I didn't know that either. Why would you know that? And he goes, "Gosh, I'm sorry. I thought and we like left it." And then the very sort of the third final year of this program, you have to develop your dissertation work in addition to taking the extra year of courses. And I was just slowly led through working with this myth that had come so alive for me, into discovering what I was really there to do, which was to really learn about the impact of trauma on the voice, but maybe with the emphasis then also being on like how we use our voices. How is the voice involved in the healing process? It brought together so many pieces of my own story. First of all, the only reason I was born is because my parents both had like were traumatized, that my father wasn't allowed to be his true self in this culture. And so he and my mom, he was a closeted gay man at a Bible college. And my mom also was like a woman at a Bible college. She was being literally silenced because women in her denomination or tradition weren't allowed to speak in church in that way. I mean, you could like make coffee and serve donuts and chat in that way and teach the children, but they weren't allowed to preach. And so the only reason my parents come together is because of this traumatic silencing of their true selves. And so I don't get to exist except through this like particular cultural wound. And so it also then was bringing in, like, it was the topic that could bring in also my deep experience and love of poetry, and certainly also performed poetry. And as I was studying trauma and depth psychology, I was always really disturbed by how people would talk about the voice and language and speech. as fundamentally something that that distanced us from our felt immediate experience of embodiment. That speech was this like rational, secondary, cognitive thing we did.
Right.
And I was like, well, that's certainly one thing people do with their voices, but that's not like what we're doing. Like, that's not what all of us are doing. That's not the only thing that's possible. And sure enough, you know, they all eventually make an exception for poetry. You know, Dan Siegel, Dr. Dan Siegel, who's the editor of the great sort of Norton series on interpersonal neurobiology and lots of books on trauma in the brain. And he writes sort of beautifully about what he feels to be poetry as the exception to the rule of how like language, you know, and the mind sort of distance us and cut us off from this lived experience, and how poetry somehow magically melts this divide and allows us to be more present. And they all write about it as if it's this mysterious, like mystical thing.
Right.
And fair enough. Sometimes, you know, it can be. But I just felt like it was like this whole part of my own lived experience was being cast into the shadow. And I thought, you know, I don't actually think that poetry is an exception to how we use language, like nor is storytelling or this natural speech that we're doing right now. Right now, I have no idea I'm not planning what I'm about to say.
Right.
And it's completely governed by my autonomic nervous system. I can't control my face or my hands, you know, it's just happening. So this is truly flowing out of like the center of my being. And while, yes, we can use language and speech to intellectualize and distance, there's this other way we use it. And the way I remember thinking of it the way it finally came to me is I was like, think of what happens when a friend asks you to be honest about something, you know, asks you like a deep, big question. What happens when you go to try to answer that question and be honest? What happens is you don't really know, you start to say it, and then you know as you're saying words if you're getting it right or not. And often you're like, oh no, that's not it. And you keep going, you keep complexifying and adding language until you reach a moment of resonance. And when I'm like getting goosebumps, when someone says something that's emotionally true, it's like, whew, they feel it, we all feel it. It literally resonates.
Right.
So I started to look I was like, where's the neuroscience of that?
Yeah.
It's like auditory, vibro-tactile, resonant experience of speaking, where we happen to know if a word is a good enough form to resonate with a meaning by feeling it in our bodies.
See, and I would share that, like, so I too almost went a different direction before hitting Pacifica, right? I almost went and got a degree in organizational psychology. Sorry. And but I didn't because of that. And I remember when I first started reading depth psychology books, some of the writers, Hillman is one of my favorites, was just beautiful. And like similar to me, for me, in a poetic way, because I knew that the choice of some of those words was intentional because of the feelings and sensations it would elicit from the body, right? And so it was the first time I had read anything related to the psychological experience, you know, the mind that had that type of soul and depth to it. And I just remember being like, oh my God, these are my people. Like I found them. Yeah, because and I think maybe the big difference, and I'm sure you'll, you know, go into this more, is the intention, right? Like you said, when we're pulling from like asking that question about like, let's be honest, blah, 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 blah. It's not just a rambling.
Yeah.
It's the intention behind the words, right? Pushes from a different place, if you will.
I think what I was fascinated by in my own life and in trauma studies work was like really what could get in the way of that. And having had a personal experience of trying to be honest and literally my voice like shutting down and starting to cry and literally being unable to say the words.
Yeah.
And being and then eventually saying something, and it's like, oh, well, I said something that's not quite the truth, but as close as I could get to the truth without my whole body shutting down.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people have this experience when emotion is involved. There's like emotional stakes, or you're going to speak something and your nervous system has learned that it is not safe to speak, to be honest.
Yep.
In my own personal life, I'll put a little trigger warning out there for sexual abuse. So anybody who needs to step away for a moment or pause and move ahead for a minute, it's okay. I'll be very brief, but to just say that my one of my sisters and I were molested as children, and the only memory I have of it, I was younger than her, so she remembers a bit more. But I remember being kind of led into a room by a male babysitter, and everything sort of, begins, and right away I say no. I'm a kid. I'm like, no, I don't want to do this. And so he like takes me out of the room and locks me in a hall closet. And that's all I remember. I remember being put in the closet in the dark, separated from my sister, who then goes on to be abused.
Yeah.
And this wasn't necessarily a repressed memory. It maybe was for a while. It resurfaced when I was 12 or 13. But it wasn't until I was doing this research in the midst of it that I realized like what an impact that moment had had on me as a very young person, right? Developmentally 4 years old. That's so early.
Right.
To learn that to say no and speak up to power and kind of resist men would actually like make things worse, would lead to further harm and potentially separate you from a position where you could help each other. Right.
Right.
And to watch how that played out through my life as an adult, and to really be honest about that, like how I had then been kind of unable really to sense boundaries that were needed and then articulate them and enforce them. Particularly with men,
Yeah.
And how that would happen even in very like warm, loving relationships. Because I had yet to do the work of understanding how my own nervous system had been wired by that kind of trauma and how my voice had been wired in that way.
Right.
And until you sort of just don't know. This is what's so crazy about the unconscious is, right? You come to it when you're just like totally mystified by your own behavior.
Yeah.
And by the choices you're making and what's happening. And it's kind of like you're trying to study, right? It's like the wind is invisible, but you can watch the leaves move.
Exactly. Oh my God, that metaphor is beautiful.
Studying the leaves. Try to understand what's moving them, even though there's an invisible force moving them. So that's what it's like with unconscious or early trauma, is that we're aware of there being this unknown, invisible sort of force that's guiding our life and our behavior. So my research really brought me into wanting to take a look at what trauma teaches us if we specifically also looked at the voice through the lens of that, how that would sort of explain some of what was going on with us, like in our attempt to try to live an honest, full life. But perhaps we had learned perhaps we'd been sort of conditioned to be people pleasers or conflict avoidant.
Right.
And maybe we hadn't had practice using our voice in certain ways, using our voice to set boundaries or say no. And the opposite can happen. Some people are conditioned out of feeling their grief, like anger is acceptable to express, but maybe grief isn't. And so the opposite will happen. Like sadness will come up in the voice and it will turn into anger.
Right.
So I was studying a phenomenon many people were studying, but really like focusing in particular on how we experience this in our own inability in some ways to like be ourselves and speak honestly and truthfully. And the other thing I discovered in the process, or that's certainly true for me, is I really don't think that we sort of know the truth and then speak it. I think we discover what's true for us in the process of trying to articulate it, particularly emotional truth. And so when we're denied this messy, rough draft process, if we don't have a safe space to do that with, if we're not allowed to try to figure it out, sometimes we are hidden even from ourselves for a very long time.
You know, I just wanted, I was having a conversation with a friend of mine yesterday about boundary setting, right? Because she's having a hard time with it. She's struggling setting boundaries, and she's being kind of hard on herself about it. And I, was very much like, here's the deal. All this stuff you see on Instagram, TikTok, whatever the fuck, makes it sound like setting boundaries is easy. And it's not. Like, it can be very, very difficult, especially if you're not great at it and you're just starting out. If you don't have a lot of support around it, right? Like,
or if you're trying to set boundaries with someone who has a lot of power over you.
Exactly.
Is it a boss? Is it a spouse? Is it, you know what I mean? There's tough.
So many, and I think like the story you shared is like such, and everything you've just shared is really such a good example, and, goes into a lot of how boundary setting is really difficult. And so like, if you're trying to set boundaries and you're struggling, like, it's okay. Like, it's not like these people are dead to me and I'm over it. Like, that's not real life. So,
there's and really it's a development process that you get to attend to now that you may have missed earlier, right? Because that development wasn't encouraged in you. I think like we have two fundamental needs as children, and the most important one is for secure attachment. Right? Because we're helpless and we can't take care of ourselves. So we need attachment relationships to adults who can care for us. And the second fundamental need is authentic self-expression. And if those two are in any way, like if your authentic self-expression in any way threatens your secure attachment, when you're a kid, it's authentic self-expression that gets repressed unconsciously to preserve.
You have to stay alive. Yeah, you have to stay alive.
There's no question. And so the dynamic usually reverses at a certain point of adulthood, late 20s, early 30s, a point at which you have enough, you've separated enough from your family, and you've built enough of a solid foundation that suddenly it's sort of the opposite is true. Like, you could live without those attachments. You may not want to, but you could. And suddenly you can't live without authentic self-expression. And so that actually becomes the bigger threat to your life, is relationships in which you cannot authentically express yourself. So then we go on a whole different journey. And sometimes it creates big ruptures for a while with our families of origin or communities, we've lived in or grown up for a long time.
So you're saying 20, like late 20s, 30s, but I have to tell you, this really resonates for me for like early 40s, midlife, like when you start looking around and you're like, wait a minute, I don't have to take this shit anymore. Like, who am I?
It happened in my early 30s. So I'm probably just like, but I work with people all the time who are hitting this crucible much, much later. And frankly, the older you are, the more bravery it requires.
Right, because you've established all these relationships and these patterns, and there's so much more dismantling that needs to occur. Yeah.
And to sort of come into real embodied agency at that point, and learn how not just to there's each step of the process is its own thing. Can I sense a boundary? Can I sense my own needs? Once I know them and sense them, can I advocate for them? Once I advocate for them, can I defend them when someone else, it sort of interferes with their agency and their needs? What happens when conflict arises? And then also, if someone's upset with me for having, some needs or expressing my agency in a certain way that's not great for them, am I comfortable letting them be upset with me and just be upset without having to smooth it over?
And this stuff is hard.
It's hard.
I mean, I am at a
we can buy it honestly, right? If you live in an environment where violence could break out, or with someone who was particularly fragile, like mentally or emotionally, an adult who was suicidal or depressed. You learned that you can't say any of that. Like you can't, you know what I mean? That it's your job in order to survive to like try to manage the emotional social field. And so you got to unlearn that.
And, you know, I'm at a point in my life where I have relationships for the first time, as weird as it is, at 44, that are so full of self-awareness, honest communication, the same thing. Like if something upsets you, maybe I'm going to let you be upset, right? Like this is the first time in my life I've had relationships like this.
Right. The more authentically you express
really
yourself,
sharing
the
about
more secure the relationship becomes, the greater the intimacy becomes.
But it's terrifying because there's so much vulnerability, and it is harder because it takes more energy and more effort, more conversations, right? Finding words for things and emotions and experiences, but fucking worth it. Like I'm digging it.
And I think you're describing the preconditions under which now you can do your life's work.
Right.
So we have to have some, you know, like this is like starting to create this network of relationships where we get to have the relationships and also be authentically ourselves, and the voice starts to get freer. Now we can start to like truly like start to work more openly and consciously with our creative life force.
Right.
And what is it that your life is here to say? Like, why are you here?
Yeah.
And I think this connection between voice and vocation, you know, which have like cognate connections, certainly within the words themselves, that there's this this deep connection as an advocacy, like all of these, it's like it's coming through the voice. And so how can like healing our voices and healing our relationship there with this great integrator that can sort of like take every single part of us and move it into sound and then make an impact on the world. Just like I discovered kind of young with poetry and language, it was like, oh, I'm not just here to like name what I see and describe what I see. I am here to like create a whole new reality. Yeah. And that requires us then, I mean, that's a whole new road. It's like, are you ready to come into relationship with your own power by using it?
Which is also slightly terrifying. And that's okay.
Wow. That's disrespectful. You better be terrified.
Yeah, right. If you're not, are you doing it right?
Like, if you're not, some messiness is about to happen, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because power, which was also one of my initial curiosities, as a younger person, it's like, and now I'm like, oh, wow. Right. We're living in a time of existential crisis for our species anyway, if not for like life itself on Earth. And we're here because of this like deep trauma in our root system, right? This fundamental disconnection and dissociation where we're living under this myth of scarcity, and we're unable, right, to sense, talk about unable to sense a boundary. We can't like sense where there's enough. We can't live in right relationship with our ecosystem and with the natural world because of this numbness that leads to like overconsumption and a culture that encourages that by frankly telling us that we're incomplete and that like it's got something to sell us that's going to make us, you know, whole and complete if only we buy this thing, and that you have to keep doing more and more and more and more.
Well, and that the only path to safety is power.
That's right.
Having power over others, right? Making yourself the biggest, strongest, more money, more guns.
Power that is a path to safety. And I would say it's power sharing. It's like coming into your own power and sharing with others who have also come into their own power and nurturing others to come into their own power, but like from a perspective of cooperation, you know, right. And from this sort of communal intelligence. where we refuse to be ignorant about the like interconnectedness of all things, and in fact seek to be deep students of it. So
and it's that vulnerability that gets in the way. Like I said, I'm having these beautiful relationships, but it's hard, it's challenging. You know, there's a lot of trust involved that for me is newer, and you know, not everyone is ready yet. And it, you know, and so I think you're right. It's about helping others come into their power by, you know, even sometimes just being present. And I think the more people who can connect to their authentic selves, it helps others see the path, see that it's possible, and have someone that they can connect with in that way.
And I think we become trustworthy when other people place their trust in us. I don't, you know, it's like we can't wait for people to be worthy of our trust before we trust them. People do not become like worthy of our trust in the absence of being sort of tasked with being guardians of our dignity in that way. We have to take a risk to like trust each other and love each other, and slowly, right? Like I'm always saying to my clients, and because I'm always saying this to myself, like, would it be possible to trust just a little bit more than you're trusting right now? Like not a lot. I want us to just like feel what it would be like to trust a little bit more. Trust yourself, trust the process, trust like each other, trust the universe, and to just fundamentally assume that you are enough.
Right.
And that you're right on time.
Yeah.
And that actually everything's unfolding exactly as it should, according to the intelligence of your own being and the intelligence of this like larger individuation process, this collective individuation process that we get to be a part of. Like what a time to be alive in the middle of this lots of stress.
I know.
Lots of transformation needed, lots of change needed, lots of feelings.
So many feelings.
Lots of people who pathologize feelings, you know.
Right, exactly.
We're kind of a mess, like as a species. It's pretty bad.
But it's such a beautiful mind shift, just like you said, that you're always enough. You're right on time. Like people ask, you know, like Adrian, like what really like shifted things for you or whatever. And I always say like, it's simple mind shifts like that, where you hear something at the right time and you're just like, oh my God, like I am enough. I am on time. Everything is unfolding exactly as it's meant to be. And if you can own that, it will change your fucking life. Like it will like change your life. It's incredible.
Just like look at your life through that particular lens. Assume its enoughness, assume it has meaning, and look at it through that. It's pretty beautiful. I mean, it makes me, the thing that gives me, I think the most like fills me up with hope is getting to see people come into their gifts. And the work we all get to do, like discovering our gifts and then learning to nurture our gifts and discovering what our gifts are really for in the process of trying to give them away, and give them away in a good way, in a way that's like, a true boon to our community and the world. And that makes me feel like, oh, the project seems really straightforward, which is I'm here to help as many people as possible like come into their gifts fully. And I imagine it's almost like I have this metaphor I imagine, which is like almost like I'm it's like you're restoring someone to their queendom, you know. Like I want to do it in such a way that they now know how to go do that for someone else, so that like each person I also nurture in that way now goes out and does it for 100 more people.
Right.
And they do it with them in such a way that those people can go out and do it. So I'm not just trying, it's like, we can heal each other. That's actually very possible and in far less time than we imagine, even though the road is hard and real. But it's like not just about that. It's about what happens next. And this like figure eight, this incredible feedback loop between healing and creativity. And like what we're here to do is create a new world by trying to model it and live it with each other.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, beautifully said. Like I said, I always love your words. Yeah. So I'm going to segue you from that. Tell us about your practice, because you have a private practice. You also teach classes, workshops. I've mentioned a couple of your books. Tell us about what you got going on. How can people work with you?
Yeah, at least two days a week, sometimes 3. I work with individuals in private practice. And that looks like totally different for each person. Like, right, it's completely customizable. And it can take us a little time. We sort of get to know, I get to know your nervous system, and I get to know your story. And we also, I feel like my job, the thing that I'm a deep student of in this situation, is just like excellent conditions. I'm good at creating great conditions. I don't know what needs to happen, and you don't need to know what needs to happen. We can place our faith entirely in the fact that your body and psyche know exactly what needs to happen, and that they're just waiting for the right conditions. So we create great conditions in which it's possible for you to feel safe enough and relax enough for a deeper process of healing to unfold. I very much use and practice somatic experiencing, Peter Levine's incredible trauma resolution work. I do a lot of like in-person like table work with people, like on a heated massage table, where it's like how can we truly like create this ideal, beautiful condition for you to just fully relax. And then we listen. Once you're finally like the vagus nerve is online, your stomach's gurgling, like things, then we listen and you tell me, right, where you're noticing pain or constriction or energy, or maybe you have a memory, or maybe a feeling bubbles up, or maybe like thoughts and meanings start to kind of filter in. And we just listen to what arises in those conditions and start to give it support. And then we watch
I love that so much.
Old, unfinished defenses are in a place where they get honored and respected, and then can kind of complete their work. So I get to restore. We restore nervous systems. We bring you back to a place that of well-being in that regard. Oftentimes, of course, we're also dealing with missing development. So it's like, oh, you never learned how to do this. So we're gonna learn how to tolerate receiving love, or we're gonna learn how to express a boundary or express anger and tolerate the fact that it's going to come out a little hot at first. Right. But like until you begin practicing, that's what the nervous system needs in order to integrate. So I do a lot of one-on-one beautiful work with people.
And that's in person and via Zoom, right?
In person and via Zoom. I do see people who don't live. I'm in Portland, Oregon. And so I do have, I would say it's probably about half and half. Which is a good mix. And then I also teach group workshops. I think group work is so powerful. I'm such a big fan of it. When you're ready to come into a group, that's where a lot of the real magic can happen, because our big family traumas and cultural traumas need a group to get activated. So good stuff can happen, even though it's and so I like to create a lot of opportunities. It's also like less expensive to come in and do a group or a workshop. Sometimes it's easier to commit to a limited, like a real limited container. Where you can do a good kind of work in. So usually once a year, I teach like a longer form group container from like October to May. So there's one that's wrapping up or just wrapped up. And for 3 years, I've been teaching a class in embodied alchemy and somatics and alchemy with a wonderful teacher named Trinity Capilli. does like work with Linda Lack in the Thinking Body, Feeling Mind, and we study depth psychology and alchemy, while also studying somatic meditation techniques, while also working with what's actually happening in the field with symptoms that are arising in people's lives and creating a good alchemical container for change and transformation.
This is so exciting to me. Makes me all like
all those lectures and somatic work practices will probably be up online in the fall to take as a solo journey. But we're going to be moving on to teach a class in embodied dream work, and the techniques of dream work and working with symbols. I also teach poetry and creative writing, and storytelling, like live, true personal storytelling. I've done a lot of work with The Moth and an organization called Backfence PDX. And I teach a workshop called Stories of Healing, or Healing Our Stories. And it's both of them. I don't remember which comes first, but where we attempt to tell the stories of our biggest healings in ways that don't re-traumatize us or traumatize an audience. But we create a safe container for people to try to work with this like really big material in life, you know? And when it comes to teaching poetry as well, I'm not like into a doctor-patient relationship with other people's art. But again, I am just like, my practice is about creating excellent conditions. It's like I can create great conditions for the creative life force to enter some generativity.
I love that so much, because it's such an honoring of the person as the expert in their life.
Yes.
Right? Like it goes even beyond like making sure they have self-agency, but it's like really fully honoring who they are as the expert in their life and helping that come forward.
Well, and it's like, it really comes down to it where it's like, okay, what do you want to use your voice for? Do you have something you need to say? Is there something you need to write? And like, how can we actually support each other in doing that work, and how activating that work is? And how thrilling it is at the end of it to get to receive from other people. Like, I mean, it's just like every time someone tells a story, even of like maybe something like a big shame they've carried, something that they went through, and they're able to tell that story in like a good way, it performs a shame healing on them and on everyone in the room. This is what I've learned about storytelling. And that we are designed to learn through storytelling and to learn how to survive from each other in this way. So even if you tell a story about like this crazy divorce you just went through, even if like I will never go through something like that in the way that it happened to you, I like actually learned something about how to survive this humiliating, difficult experience of being human from you and your honesty and you're willing to take the risk. And it makes all of us stronger and more connected. It like, it's how we develop receptivity and empathy.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So I will just say to anyone listening or watching, Dr. Mindy Nettifee is fucking amazing. If you feel called to work with her in any way, do it. Like, your work has always fascinated me beyond belief. And there's been so many times that I've wanted to go to a workshop or, you know, do one-on-one work with you, and the timing just never worked out and blah, blah, blah. But I'm keeping an eye out for this alchemy stuff, because you know me and alchemy. So very excited.
We would be a review for you. Like, but yes.
Yeah, but you know, but it's different to write about something, present about something, than it is to move through something for yourself. And as a teacher,
there's a way in which like each of us has a transmission. There's like, I have a vibration. And so other people can be teaching the same things that I'm teaching, and it's going to come through all of us in a unique way, in a way that's maybe needed.
Yeah. So your website is The Cult of Mindy.
thecultofmindy.com.
Yeah.
is where to find all my poetry work or upcoming workshops. And you can also find a link to my Substack newsletter, which is called In the River of What's Happening Now. If you're into the moon and the astrology of individuation, that's my little side project where I just share with the world my own deep love and reverence for the moon and the study of the natural world and the timing that's unfolding right now, which is my own deep healing practice around also, my ancestry with religion. To also just live my life in such a way that it empowers other people to have their own relationship with the sacred.
Yeah. Dude, rock on. I love it. I'm so glad I got to have you on tonight because I just love spending time with you.
Yeah, I'm like filled with joy right now.
No, I know, right? Me too.
Just be in to be in your energy and your space again. I'm just a huge fan. And we've been through the fire together.
Yes. And we made it.
I mean, there's more fires to come, but we're
Obviously.
we're here and we're thriving and
yes.
I'm like proud to know you. Yeah.
Oh, honey, me too. Absolutely. So it's about time. So I'm going to wrap us up, and I will just say the question I ask pretty much everyone is: there was just one thing you wanted anyone listening or watching to take with them, what would it be?
Oh, wow. There's a poem right above my desk by Louise Gluck, and it's called The Wild Iris. And its very first line is, "At the end of my suffering, there was a door."
Oh my God, it's going to make me cry. Oh.
And if you have been in it, and going through a time of great inner or outer war or great suffering, I just want you to know that it leads to something, that there's a path that you can take next and a door that you can open. And that brokenheartedness is actually the beginning. It's an initiation. It's the beginning of all true reception, as Jack Hirschman would say. So welcome to your initiation. Welcome to the trauma healing party. I'm so happy to have you here.
Join the group. It's toasty in here.
You knew how good it was on the other side,
Exactly.
Yeah. Right.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Oh, thank you again. Thank you everyone for joining us. And ciao for now. Thank you so much for joining us on the Energetic Psyche, a weekly podcast that live streams every Tuesday night at 7 p.m. Central Standard Time. We hope to see you again in the future, and I hope you have a great week.